For 7 long years, a loyal dog waited at the same spot, believing his owner would return. This is his story of love and faith. When his owner left and never came back, the faithful dog never gave up hope, waiting day after day, year after year. A story of loyalty beyond imagination, a dog who spent 7 years waiting, proving love never fades even in silence. They called him the Dog of Hope. 7 years, through rain and sun, he sat waiting for the one who never returned. The story of loyalty often comes wrapped in simple forms, and sometimes it appears in ways that shake the heart with its purity. This story begins in a quiet neighborhood in a mid-sized American town, where the sound of birds in the morning mixed with the rumble of buses carrying workers and students. It was in this neighborhood that a boy named Michael lived with his family, and more importantly, with a golden brown dog named Shadow. Shadow wasn't a prize-winning breed, nor was he trained for show competitions, but he carried a presence that turned heads whenever he padded along the sidewalks beside Michael. With his calm eyes, alert ears, and the kind of tail that wagged like a slow pendulum of happiness, Shadow became more than just a pet. He was a constant, a companion, and the keeper of Michael's secrets. Michael had found Shadow as a puppy near the edge of a forest road. A storm had passed the night before, and in the wet grass by the roadside, the small trembling bundle had been left abandoned. Michael, still in his teenage years then, scooped the tiny creature up without hesitation. The bond was instant. He wrapped him in his jacket, brought him home, and fed him scraps from the kitchen until the puppy's fear turned into trust. From that moment on, Shadow never left his side. The name was earned quickly, because no matter where Michael went, Shadow followed. Whether Michael was biking to the lake, studying late at night, or even sitting quietly on the porch, Shadow's paws weren't far behind. Over the years, their bond deepened in a way words could barely describe. Michael often said that Shadow could sense his moods before even he could. When Michael was angry or stressed, Shadow would sit beside him quietly, pressing his warm body close, offering silent comfort. When Michael celebrated small victories, passing exams, learning to drive, Shadow leapt around as though he too understood triumph. Friends came and went, but Shadow remained steady. In those years of youthful uncertainty, the dog became the anchor Michael relied on. Life, however, has a way of pulling even the closest companions apart. After high school, Michael faced the difficult decision of pursuing college in another city. The idea of leaving Shadow behind was unthinkable, but circumstances forced his hand. His parents promised to care for the dog, and Michael assured himself that it was only temporary. Shadow would still have the same porch, the same backyard, the same family. Yet even as Michael packed his bags and prepared to leave, the dog seemed to sense something shifting. Shadow followed him closely the night before the departure, lying by his bed, resting his head on Michael's shoes as if afraid that if he closed his eyes, Michael would disappear. The morning of departure was quiet. Michael bent down, hugging Shadow tightly, whispering promises into his fur. "I'll be back, boy. Just wait for me. I'll be back." Shadow's eyes followed him as he got into the car, tail wagging uncertainly, as if unsure whether this was just another temporary outing or something much longer. Michael didn't know that those words, "I'll be back," would carve themselves into the soul of his loyal dog, guiding his behavior for years to come. Shadow waited. At first, he sat by the door every evening, ears perked at the sound of any car approaching the house. Each time tires crunched on the gravel, his body stiffened with hope, only to relax in disappointment when it wasn't Michael. Days turned into weeks, and Shadow adapted, but not by moving on. Instead, he developed a ritual. Every day around the same hour Michael had left, Shadow would trot to the front gate, lie down, and keep his eyes fixed on the road. It didn't matter whether it rained, snowed, or blazed hot under the summer sun. He waited with the patience only a dog's heart could endure. The neighborhood took notice. Children walking home from school would often pause to pat his head, saying, "Still waiting, huh, Shadow?" Neighbors brought him treats, impressed by his devotion. Some even tried to coax him away from his vigil, but he would always return to the same spot by the gate, as though tethered by an invisible thread of love. Seasons cycled. Michael, caught up in the whirlpool of college life and then a job that demanded long hours, couldn't return home as often as he wanted. He called his parents and asked about Shadow, and they always said the dog was fine. But they didn't tell him about the ritual, about how deeply Shadow clung to the memory of his promise. They didn't want him to worry. Years passed. Shadow grew older, his once golden brown coat turning silver around the muzzle, his movements slowing. But the ritual never broke. Morning walks were still part of his day, but when the hour approached, he limped back to the gate and lowered himself down, his eyes still searching. 7 long years stretched across his life like a chain of quiet days, each one ending with disappointment but never with surrender. To the people around, Shadow became a legend of loyalty. The mailman told new residents about him. Shopkeepers shared his story with customers. The dog who waited, that was how he was known. His silent vigil became a kind of monument, a reminder that loyalty was not just a word but a living act. When Michael finally did return, it wasn't with the triumphant spirit he had imagined years ago. Life had worn him down with its hardships, missed opportunities, and the fatigue of endless striving. He came back not as the ambitious boy who had once promised to return quickly, but as a man humbled by time. As he walked up the familiar road toward his family's house, suitcase dragging behind him, he noticed the shape by the gate. An old dog, lying still, head resting on paws. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of footsteps, and for a moment, age fell away. He lifted his head, eyes cloudy but brightening with recognition. The tail thumped weakly, the body tried to rise but faltered. Michael dropped the suitcase, running forward, tears spilling as he fell to his knees and embraced his dog. 7 years of waiting ended in that single moment. Shadow pressed his head against Michael's chest, letting out a sigh that seemed to carry all the weight of the years he had endured. Neighbors watched quietly from their windows, some wiping their own tears. The story had come full circle, the boy had returned, and the dog who had never given up had been proven right. The reunion was brief in the measure of time, but infinite in the measure of love. For Shadow, the promise had been fulfilled. For Michael, it was a lesson carved deeply into his soul, that loyalty was not something you demanded, but something you earned and cherished, and that once given, it could outlast years of absence. And though Shadow would only live a short while longer after that reunion, the memory of his vigil lived on. The town still speaks of the dog who waited 7 years, a story passed on to children as both legend and truth. A reminder that sometimes the purest love is wordless, patient, and unbreakable, even in the silence of waiting. After the reunion, Michael felt as though time had slowed, giving him the chance to live in the moments he had missed. Shadow was older, his muzzle nearly white, his legs stiff with age, but the joy that glowed in his eyes whenever Michael stepped into a room was enough to erase years of separation. Michael would wake in the mornings to find Shadow already by the side of his bed, waiting patiently to follow him into the day. Though the dog's steps were slower, he remained determined to be at Michael's side, refusing to surrender the role he had held since puppyhood. For Michael, every walk, every shared meal, and every quiet evening together felt like stolen treasure, a chance to rebuild the years that had slipped away. The neighbors watched with warmth as the two resumed their bond. They had seen Shadow wait for nearly 7 years, never faltering, and now they saw the reward of that loyalty. Children pointed excitedly when they saw Michael and Shadow walking down the familiar path, whispering, "That's the dog who waited." The story spread further, with friends, relatives, and even strangers visiting to witness the living proof of loyalty. In those quiet suburban streets, Shadow had become a kind of legend, a symbol of devotion that people found inspiring in their own lives. Couples spoke of him when discussing commitment, parents told their children the tale as a lesson in patience, and even those who had no pets of their own felt moved by the idea of a heart that never gave up hope. Michael, however, carried both joy and guilt. He could not escape the truth that he had left Shadow behind, forcing him into those years of waiting. The knowledge that his dog had endured winters of snow, summers of heat, and countless evenings of disappointment just to keep a promise alive weighed heavily on him. Yet Shadow's wagging tail and eager eyes reminded him not to dwell in regret. Dogs did not keep score. They did not measure love in terms of time lost or mistakes made. They gave love wholly, without demand for repayment, and Shadow's forgiveness was as complete as his loyalty. As weeks turned into months, Michael began to notice the fragility of time pressing in. Shadow's body, though still strong in spirit, was failing him. His joints ached more with every passing day, his appetite waned, and his once lively gait had slowed to a shuffle. The veterinarian confirmed what Michael already feared: Shadow was in the final chapter of his life. The years of waiting had taken their toll, but more than that, age was simply catching up with him. Michael knew then that his duty was no longer to ask for more years, but to give Shadow the dignity, comfort, and love he deserved in his last ones. So Michael made a choice. He reorganized his life, cutting down on long work hours, refusing projects that would pull him away, and dedicating himself to his dog. Together they visited the park where Michael had played as a child, the lake where they had once gone swimming, and even the roadside where Michael had first found the trembling puppy years ago. At each place, Shadow's nose would twitch, his ears would perk, and for a moment, the years seemed to peel away. These pilgrimages became sacred journeys, a way of closing the circle of their shared story. On quiet nights, Michael would sit by Shadow's side, stroking his fur, telling him stories about his college years, his struggles, his hopes for the future. He spoke as though the dog understood every word, and in some ways he believed Shadow did. The dog's eyes, though clouded, carried a wisdom beyond words. They seemed to say that none of the mistakes mattered, that what counted was being there, truly being present now. In those conversations, Michael found not only comfort but also healing. Shadow became more than a pet again. He became a teacher, reminding him of what truly mattered in life: love, loyalty, and time well spent. The day finally came when Shadow could no longer rise to meet Michael at the door. He lay on his blanket, breathing shallowly, his once powerful chest now moving with effort. Michael sat beside him, tears streaming, whispering once more the words he had spoken years ago. "I'll be here, boy. I won't leave you." This time, he kept the promise. He stayed through the night, holding Shadow, until the dog took one last breath, exhaling with a quiet sigh that felt like peace. Shadow's head rested in his lap, and though grief tore at Michael's heart, there was also a strange sense of calm. Shadow had waited, and Michael had returned. The circle was complete. The loss spread through the neighborhood like news of a relative. People stopped by to pay their respects, some leaving flowers by the gate where Shadow had spent his years of vigil. Children drew pictures of the golden dog who waited, taping them to the fence. The local paper even ran a small piece about him, calling Shadow the dog who taught us the meaning of loyalty. The story touched hearts beyond the community, and soon messages began arriving from people who had read about him online. Families from other towns sent letters, sharing how Shadow's devotion inspired them to spend more time with their pets or mend broken relationships. What had started as a simple dog's act of waiting had rippled outward into countless lives, reminding people that love could be patient, steadfast, and unbreakable. For Michael, life after Shadow was quiet but filled with purpose. He could not let the story fade. He began volunteering at animal shelters, telling Shadow's story to potential adopters, encouraging them to see beyond breeds or appearances and instead focus on the bond they could build. He sponsored adoption drives, placing photos of Shadow with captions like, "Loyalty waits for you too." Each time a dog found a home, he felt as though a part of Shadow's spirit lived on, guiding others to the companionship he had once given. Years later, Michael published a memoir, not about himself, but about Shadow. He wrote with raw honesty, recounting the day he found the puppy, the years of waiting, the reunion, and the final goodbye. The book, titled The Dog Who Waited, resonated with readers around the world. Pet owners wrote back with their own stories of loyalty, loss, and love. Some said they cried while reading, others said it helped them heal from the loss of their own companions. In sharing Shadow's life, Michael discovered that his dog's story was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone who had ever loved and been loved by an animal. The legacy of Shadow grew beyond what anyone could have imagined. A statue was later commissioned in the town park, depicting a dog sitting faithfully at a gate, eyes fixed on the horizon. The plaque beneath it read, "In memory of Shadow, the dog who waited 7 years for his owner's return." A reminder of loyalty beyond time. Families visited the statue, children asked about him, and parents retold the story, keeping the legend alive for new generations. The town had many landmarks, but none carried the same quiet power as the figure of a dog who taught people the meaning of devotion. Michael never forgot the lessons Shadow gave him. He built a life that prioritized presence over ambition, relationships over accolades. Whenever he faced hard choices, he asked himself, what would Shadow have done? The answer was always simple: stay loyal, stay patient, stay true. In his friendships, in his family, and in his work, he carried that principle, spreading it like ripples in water. And though the years continued to move forward, the bond he shared with Shadow remained timeless, unbroken by absence, unchanged by death. The story of Shadow became more than just a tale of one dog's loyalty. It became a reflection of what love could be when stripped of conditions. It reminded people that loyalty wasn't about grand gestures, but about consistency, about showing up every day even when it's hard. Shadow's vigil, day after day by the gate, became an emblem of that truth. In a world that often rushed, forgot, and moved on too quickly, Shadow stood as proof that some hearts never waver. And so the legend lived on. The dog who waited 7 years for his owner's return became not just a story passed down, but a guide for living. It taught people to honor promises, to value patience, and to believe in love that endures. Michael often walked by the statue in the park, sometimes with a new rescue dog by his side, and he would smile through the bittersweet ache in his chest. He knew that though Shadow was gone, his spirit lingered, in the town, in the families touched by his tale, and most of all, in the heart of the boy he had once followed, who had grown into a man forever changed by his loyal companion. The story ends not with Shadow's passing, but with his memory standing eternal, carved into the lives he touched. Because loyalty does not vanish with time, nor does love fade with absence. The dog who waited had proven that sometimes, the truest measure of love is not in how loudly it speaks, but in how quietly it endures, year after year, until the one it waits for finally returns.